Maisie Wren has three great loves: the illustration deadlines she perpetually misses, her cozy cottage in Millhaven, Vermont, and instant noodles from the village's only convenience store. So when brooding ex-billionaire Julian Holt buys said store and introduces what she can only describe as corporate ramen rationing, she takes it very, very personally. Welcome to Flustered novel, where love is chaotic, confessions are awkward, and every story comes with butterflies, drama, and a little emotional damage. Grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's dive into today's romance story. The thing about Millhaven is that nothing ever changes. That's not a complaint. It's the whole point. It's a town of 400 people, one traffic light, a bakery run by a 70-year-old woman named Dottie who calls everyone Pumpkin, and a convenience store that has been called Millhaven General since approximately the dawn of civilization. Nothing dramatic happens here. The most exciting thing in recent memory was the summer a black bear wandered into the library and sat on a beanbag chair for 40 minutes while everyone watched through the window and someone called the news. I chose Millhaven on purpose. My name is Maisie Wren. I'm 27, I illustrate children's books for a living, and I relocated here from Boston 2 years ago after what my therapist kindly called a prolonged episode of life not going according to plan, and what I call setting my ambitions on fire and watching them burn while eating convenience store noodles. The noodles, crucially, were very good. They remain the cornerstone of my diet and my primary reason for leaving my cottage on weekdays. Some people have coffee. I have Millhaven General's instant noodle aisle. More specifically, I have the shrimp flavor, shelf position 4, second from the left. I have memorized this the way pilots memorize instrument panels. It is not something I'm proud of, but it is something I accept. Old Pete, the previous owner of Millhaven General, understood me. He kept a running tab for me on a notepad behind the register, and never once made me feel judged for purchasing 9 packets of instant noodles in a single visit. He'd just nod, tear off my receipt, and tell me I was a good kid. Pete retired to Florida in April, and I cried a little, which felt excessive until I remembered he was taking the notepad system with him. I was not prepared for what happened next. I was not prepared for the truck that arrived on a Tuesday morning, the way the old hand-painted sign came down with a power drill screaming like it was offended, or the crisp white banner that went up in its place. Holt's General Millhaven. I was not prepared for the man who stepped out to inspect the banner's alignment with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb. He was tall. Unreasonably so. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and dark trousers that still somehow looked like they cost more than my laptop. His hair was slightly too long for someone who used to be on the cover of Forbes. I recognized him in pieces, the way you recognize a word in a foreign language that's close enough to your own. Julian Holt. The Julian Holt, former CEO of Holt Industries, which did something complicated in finance and technology that I had never fully understood, but which had made him the kind of rich that makes other rich people feel poor. He looked up from the banner. He looked at me. I was standing on the pavement holding my tote bag and my coffee, wearing paint-stained overalls and one sock that had a small duck on it. "Store's not open yet," he said. His voice was exactly what you'd expect. Low-clipped, no wasted syllables. I looked at the banner. I looked at him. "Pete kept my tab," I said, which was not the triumphant opening statement I deserved. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite the opposite of one either. "Pete," he said, "is in Florida." He went back inside. The door closed behind him with a small, decisive click. That was the beginning of everything. I just didn't know it yet. The store opened on a Wednesday. I gave it 2 days out of what I told myself was respect for a new business, and what was actually time spent finishing a deadline, and therefore not leaving my cottage. When I finally pushed open the door to Holt's General on Friday morning, I was not prepared. The place had been reorganized. Old Pete's shop had the warm, beloved chaos of a place that had been arranged once in 1987, and left largely alone. The noodle aisle had been shelf 3. I knew shelf 3 the way I knew my own name. I knew it in the dark. I had once navigated to it while half asleep at 7 a.m. during a deadline crunch, and located the shrimp flavor by muscle memory alone. Shelf 3 was now the condiment aisle. I stood in front of rows of ketchup and sriracha and felt something cold move through me. Looking for something? Julian Holt was behind the register. He had a clipboard. An actual clipboard. Who owned a clipboard in this decade? "The noodles," I said. "Aisle 6. I went to aisle 6. The noodles were there, reorganized by brand and then by flavor in alphabetical order. Chicken. Shrimp was at the end. This was an outrage. Shrimp is the superior flavor and should be front and center by any reasonable metric. but I grabbed 3 packets and brought them to the register. Julian scanned them without looking up. That'll be $4.50. Pete charged me $1.25 each. New ownership. He finally looked up. New prices. I stared at him. You raised the price of instant noodles. I corrected the price of instant noodles. The previous markup was irrational. Irrational, I repeated. They're instant noodles. They're a product. Products have market rates. I paid, because I needed the noodles, but I walked home with my jaw set and a feeling in my chest that felt suspiciously like the beginning of a grudge. I was not, generally speaking, a grudge-holding person. I was more of a forgive and forget but also maybe complain to Dottie about it person. Dottie at the bakery was Millhaven's primary emotional processing center. He reorganized the noodles, I told her, settling onto the stool at the bakery counter. Dottie handed me a cinnamon roll without being asked. She did this when she sensed distress. I saw the truck come in, she said. Julian Holt. Can you imagine? A man like that buying Pete's shop. Why would he do that? Dottie tilted her head in the way she did when she knew more than she was saying. Burnout, they're saying. Walked out of his own company in February. Didn't tell anyone, just left. Very dramatic. I thought about the clipboard. He doesn't seem burnt out. He seems like he brought his entire corporate personality to a convenience store in Vermont. Dottie smiled into her coffee. Pumpkin, she said. That's what burnt out looks like when it's wearing a suit. The following Monday I returned to Holt's General with a plan. The plan was charm. I was objectively a fairly charming person. I had a good smile. I was known in Millhaven for my warm personality and my willingness to help people move furniture. I had once talked a raccoon out of Dottie's storage shed using nothing but a calm voice and a granola bar. I could handle one former billionaire. I'd like to reinstate my tab, I said, placing both hands flat on the counter in what I hoped was a businesslike manner. Julian looked up from his clipboard. The same one, or possibly a different one. I was beginning to suspect he had several, and regarded me. No. Pete had a tab system. Pete's tab system was a notepad with first names and approximate numbers that bore no relationship to actual debt. It was not a system. It was a suggestion. It worked for 10 years. It resulted in $1,200 in unrecovered revenue, which I found written on the back of a takeout menu. I opened my mouth. Closed it. That's a lot of instant noodles. Not all of it was yours. I wasn't sure if that was an accusation or a mercy. Fine, I said. Not up. But I'd like to propose a loyalty program. He blinked. It was the most expressive thing I'd seen him do. A loyalty program. I'm here 5 days a week. I'm your most loyal customer. A stamp card. 10th noodle free. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I started to think I'd actually gotten through to him. That beneath the clipboard and the alphabetized shrimp flavor, there was a reasonable human being who understood the value of regular customers. No, he said. Why not? Because you'd fill the card yourself. I can see the pens in your bag from here. You're an illustrator. I looked down. There were, in fact, 4 pens visibly protruding from my tote bag. I'm insulted, I said. You're predictable, he said. $4.50. I paid. I took my noodles. But at the door I turned around because I remembered something I'd almost forgotten in the indignity of the moment. Your condiment aisle faces the wrong direction, I said. The light comes in from the east window in the morning. Anyone reaching for something on that shelf is going to be squinting directly into the sun. I left before he could respond. But the next day, when I came in for my morning noodle run, the condiment aisle had been rotated 45 degrees. He didn't mention it. I didn't mention it. I paid my $4.50 and walked home with something warm sitting unexpectedly in my chest, which I chose to attribute to the weather. It happened on a Thursday. I walked into Holt's General at my usual time, tote bag over one shoulder, still in yesterday's braid, paint on my left elbow from an illustration of a frog that had gotten slightly out of hand. I went to aisle 6. I picked up 6 packets. I was in the middle of a deadline stretch and intended to eat nothing else for 4 days, which was not ideal but was deeply efficient. And I brought them to the counter. Julian looked at the noodles. Julian looked at me. He reached beneath the counter and produced, with the gravity of a man unveiling legislation, a laminated sign. Store policy. Maximum 3 units of instant noodles per customer per day. No exceptions. Management. I read it twice. You made a sign, I said. It's a policy. You made a sign about me. It applies to all customers. Name one other customer who has ever purchased 6 packets of instant noodles at once. He said nothing, which was an answer. This is targeted regulation, I said. This is a violation of. I paused because I wasn't sure what it was a violation of, exactly. Of the spirit of commerce. The spirit of commerce, he said, is that I set the terms. 3 isn't enough for a deadline week. Then eat something else. I can't eat something else during a deadline week. My brain doesn't work if I change variables. He looked at me with an expression that suggested he was trying to determine if I was serious, and had landed on yes. You're telling me your creative process requires a specific brand of noodles. I'm telling you my creative process requires predictability, and you have thrown my entire aisle into chaos. A muscle in his jaw moved. I was learning that this was the Julian Holt equivalent of a laugh. 3 packets, he said. Per day. Per visit, I said. I'll come back. There's a 6-hour window between visits. I stared at him. You've preempted me. I've anticipated you. There's a difference. I bought my 3 packets. I came back 5 hours and 58 minutes later for 3 more. I smiled very sweetly at the security camera on my way in. Julian was behind the register and said nothing, but he took a very long moment to scan my noodles, and I had the distinct impression he was fighting something. Later, I would learn that was the first time he had actively looked forward to someone walking through his door. He didn't tell me this for months, but I liked knowing it now. The Millhaven Summer Fete was the social event of the season, which was a significant thing to say about a season that also contained Dottie's birthday, the annual scarecrow competition, and the one weekend everyone mysteriously went apple picking. The fete meant stalls, a raffle, and a bake sale in the town square. It also meant, as I discovered on a bright July morning, that Julian Holt had signed up for a stall. Not a bake sale stall. A good stall. He was selling surplus store inventory at cost price in what he described, to anyone who would listen, as a community redistribution initiative, and what I recognized as a man who had run international logistics and now had nowhere to put the instinct. His stall was, objectively, the most organized table at the fete. Everything was labeled, priced, and arranged by category. There was a handwritten sign in crisp block lettering. There was correct change ready in a small sorted tray. My stall, directly across from his, had hand-painted bunting that was slightly uneven, jars of jam with illustrated labels that Dottie and I had done together at midnight, and a pyramid of brownies that was structurally ambitious. Your bunting's crooked, Julian said. It's whimsical, I said. It's a fire hazard near the candle. I moved the candle. He pretended not to notice. The morning went well. I sold 11 jars of jam and all the brownies, and Dottie sold enough pastries to fund the library roof repair, and Julian sold out his surplus stock by 11 a.m., and then had nothing to do, which I could see was causing him something close to physical distress. You can help me, I said, taking mercy. He looked at my stall. With what? The jam labels are handmade. People like knowing the story. Tell them the story. I don't know the story. The jam is from Dottie's garden. Dottie's had the garden for 40 years. There's a whole story. He was quiet. Then, with the reluctance of a man who had once negotiated with international trade boards, he moved behind my stall and picked up a jar of strawberry jam. By noon, Julian Holt was telling the story of Dottie's garden to a queue of 6 people with the focused precision of a product launch. He had developed talking points. He had segmented the customer base by flavor preference. He had, at one point, used the word provenance about strawberry jam. I stood to the side and watched him and felt something shift behind my ribs, gentle and inconvenient, like a book falling off a shelf. You're good at this, I said, when the queue thinned. He looked almost startled. Like a compliment was a thing he'd forgotten how to receive. It's just information management. It's people, I said. You're good with people when you forget to be bad at it. He looked at me for a long moment. The summer sun was making everything golden and slightly unfair. Your brownie pyramid fell, he said. I spun around. It had. But he had already moved to catch the last 3 before they hit the grass, and when I turned back he was holding them with both hands and looking mildly triumphant. And that was the moment I understood I was in a great deal of trouble. His name was Callum Reed, and he arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday with a camera, a press badge from a national lifestyle magazine, and an assignment to find Julian Holt. I found out because he stopped in Dottie's first, asked if she knew where a Julian Holt might be, and Dottie, bless her, the woman was a vault, said she'd never heard of him and then called me the second he walked out. Journalist. Young, nice jacket, bad shoes for the terrain, she reported. Give the man some warning. I went directly to Holt's General. Julian was reorganizing the biscuit section when I came in at a speed that was technically not running but was not walking either. He looked up. "There's a journalist in town," I said. "Looking for you." Something moved across his face. Not panic. I wasn't sure Julian Holt was capable of panic in the conventional sense, but something like a door closing very quickly behind his eyes. "How long do I have?" "He's at the inn." Dottie gave him directions to the wrong end of town first, so maybe an hour. He set down the biscuits. "I can't be here." "Then come with me." I don't know exactly why I said it. I had a cottage and a deadline, and a very legitimate reason to be uninvolved in the personal drama of a man who had rationed my noodles. But there it was. We walked to my cottage across the field path, Julian Holt moving through the tall grass of Millhaven like a man who had spent too long in glass buildings and didn't quite know what to do with open sky. I unlocked the door. He stepped inside. He stopped. My cottage was, to put it kindly, an illustrator's space. Every flat surface had either a drawing on it, a reference book, or a mug with a specific purpose that only I understood. The walls had pinned sketches and color swatches, and a post-it timeline for a book about a very small bear finding her way home. It was organized in the way that looked like chaos to anyone who wasn't me. Julian stood in the middle of it and looked around slowly, the way people look at art they don't understand but aren't ready to dismiss. "This is your system," he said. "Yes. It works for you." "Every deadline for 2 years." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mine stopped working." He said it simply, without dramatics. "Like reporting weather." I understood then what Dottie had meant. What burnout looks like when it's wearing a suit. What it looks like when the suit comes off is a man standing in a stranger's messy cottage, looking at her pin board of a small bear finding her way home, and not having anywhere to be for the first time in years. I made tea. We sat at my kitchen table while a journalist from a national magazine walked the wrong end of Millhaven looking for him. And Julian Holt told me, quietly and in no particular order, about the company he had built and the morning he had walked out of it, and why he had driven to Vermont and stopped here. "I passed 3 other towns," he said. "Why Millhaven?" He was quiet. The sign for Pete's General had a crooked apostrophe. I thought someone should fix that. I laughed. Actually laughed, a full one, the kind that surprises you. And he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Something open and slightly unguarded. I realized I had been wrong about the door closing behind his eyes. I think the door had been open. I just hadn't been looking at the right angle. It started as a dare. We were arguing, which was by August, our primary mode of communication, and also possibly our love language, though I would not have admitted that at the time, about whether instant noodles constituted a meal. "They are a meal," I said, for what was probably the 14th time since we'd met. We were sitting on the bench outside the store. He'd started leaving it unlocked for the evening air, which I maintained was because I'd told him people liked a bench, and he maintained was a coincidence. "They are a snack," he said. "A snack is a rice cake. A snack is 3 almonds. What I consume for dinner is a meal. It's processed wheat in salty water. It's salty joy." He gave me the look. The jaw muscle one. "You couldn't make them better," I said, which was not my most sophisticated argument, but came from somewhere genuine. "I absolutely could. You've probably never made them at all." He didn't answer immediately, and in that pause I understood that I was correct, and I felt the particular delight of being correct about Julian Holt, which had a specific flavor. "I'll make you a better version," he said. 1 week. "What do I get when you fail? What do you get when I succeed?" We looked at each other. The evening light was being unreasonably beautiful, and I wished it would stop. "If you fail," I said, "the 3-noodle policy is abolished." "If I succeed," he said, "you stop coming in before 7:30 a.m. I've come in at 7:15 twice. 7 times. I opened my mouth. "You've been counting?" He looked at the middle distance. "Store records." A week later he knocked on my cottage door at 7 p.m. carrying a pot. Not a saucepan. A brooding pot. He had made broth, actual broth from scratch, with ginger and garlic and something that smelled like it had been simmering for hours, and he'd soft-boiled eggs with a precision that suggested he had researched the exact timing, and he'd used the shrimp noodles as a base and built something from them that was so far beyond what I made that I felt a little embarrassed on behalf of my dinner habits. I didn't say it was better. I didn't have to. He watched my face and something in him went quiet and warm in a way I felt rather than saw. "The policy stands," he said. "The policy is inhumane," I said, mouth full. He sat at my table without being invited, which he'd started doing some weeks ago and which I'd stopped noticing, which was perhaps the most telling thing of all. He watched me eat with an expression that I was only now learning to read. Julian Holt didn't smile with his mouth most of the time. He smiled with his eyes very slightly, like he was rationing that too. But he wasn't rationing it tonight. Marcus Webb arrived on a Friday. I'd heard the name. Julian had mentioned him once briefly, his co-founder, the man who had run Holt Industries in Julian's absence, the man who had been calling the number Julian no longer answered. Marcus Webb wore a suit that cost more than Millhaven's annual fete budget, drove a car that made several locals stop and stare, and walked into Holt's General like a man completing a rescue mission. I was there when it happened. I was in aisle 6, which was my habit and my right, and I heard the door and then I heard a voice that had never been in this store before. Jules. Seriously. We need to talk. Julian, behind the register, said nothing. But I watched his shoulders do something, a subtle repositioning, like a man putting on armor he'd thought he'd taken off. I stayed in aisle 6. I did not eavesdrop. I simply was present in the noodle section, and could not help the acoustics of a small shop. Marcus made his case efficiently. The board missed Julian. The company needed him. There was a deal being negotiated that only Julian could close. He'd prepared a presentation. He had a folder. Julian listened. He always listened. That was something I'd learned about him. He was a precise, complete listener, the kind that made you feel your words were being taken seriously even when the answer was going to be no. No, Julian said. You built this company. I know what I built. Then come back and protect it. A pause. And then Julian said something I hadn't expected. Walk with me. They went outside. I gave it a minute, and then went to the window, which was not eavesdropping, it was simply window looking. Julian was showing Marcus the town. The bench. The bakery. Dottie's window boxes. The field path. He was showing him the way you show someone something you've claimed as your own. Marcus said something. Julian shook his head. Marcus looked at the store, then at Julian, then, and this was the part that stopped my breath. He looked at the window and saw me looking out of it. He looked back at Julian. Julian looked at the window. I ducked. This was not my most dignified moment. I heard the door open. I was back in aisle 6 at a speed I was proud of. Julian came in alone. He's gone, he said. I wasn't watching, I said. You were absolutely watching. I was looking for the sesame oil. It's in aisle 4. You know that. He came and stood at the end of the aisle, hands in his pockets. He thinks I've lost my mind. Have you? He looked at me for a long time. Julian Holt, who measured everything, who organized everything, who had flown across the world to argue in boardrooms and had ended up in a Vermont convenience store with a 3-noodle policy and a jar of sesame oil in the wrong aisle. No, he said. I think I've found it. I put the sesame oil in my basket even though I had no current use for sesame oil. Good, I said. Your condiment aisle's in the right place now anyway. He almost smiled. Full face this time. Just almost. It was Dottie who finally said what everyone in Millhaven had been saying for 2 months. Pumpkin, she said, handing me a cinnamon roll I had not asked for, which meant we were in serious territory. That man looks at you the way my Harold looked at me before he worked up the nerve. And Harold took 4 months, which nearly killed me. We argue constantly, I said. Yes, said Dottie. And I ate the cinnamon roll. He reorganized my noodle aisle. He rotated his condiment section for you. That was practical. He made you broth from scratch. That was a bet. He reserved the last pack of shrimp flavor every single day in case you came in late. Dottie looked at me with the serenity of a woman who has been right about many things for 70 years. He told me when I asked. Very casually. Said it was inventory management. I put down the cinnamon roll. Every single day. I went to the store. The bell above the door made its small sound and Julian looked up from, not a clipboard this time, actually a book. He'd started doing that in the quiet afternoons. Reading behind the counter. The first time I'd seen it I'd had to pretend to look at the magazine rack, for a full minute to compose myself. The last shrimp flavor pack, I said. Dottie told me. He was quiet for a moment. He set the book down with the care of someone who needed something to do with their hands. It's inventory management. Julian. He looked at me. I had prepared approximately nothing for this moment. I had no speech, no plan, no strategy. I was wearing my duck sock again, as it happened, because Thursdays were laundry days and I never caught up. I like arguing with you, I said. Genuinely. Not just as a complaint. I like it because you're the only person who argues back and means it and still moves the condiment shelf. Something in his face moved. The door, the one I'd been watching for months, came fully open. I've been reserving the packet, he said, since week 2. I did the math. That's over 3 months. Yes. That's a lot of inventory management. Yes. He came around the counter. He was tall enough that I had to tilt my head, which I'd gotten used to and which I now suspected had been part of my undoing. I came here because I didn't know what I wanted, he said. That was the first honest thing I'd admitted to myself in years. And now, Julian Holt, who had reorganized an entire store, who had rationed noodles with policy documentation, who had made broth from scratch and brought it across a field in a stock pot, looked at me with an expression so unguarded and specific that I felt it land somewhere behind my sternum. Now, he said, I'm looking at it. I kissed him first. This was, in retrospect, entirely on brand. He kissed me back like a man who had been waiting patiently and was done waiting. And somewhere outside, I was fairly certain the population of Millhaven, Vermont, was quietly watching through various windows and feeling tremendously satisfied about it. Epilogue, 6 months later. The sign above the door of Holt's General now has a small illustrated frog on it. Julian hated it for approximately 2 days and then stopped mentioning it, which, as I have learned, is how Julian Holt expresses deep affection. The frog is wearing a tiny bow tie. I illustrated it at midnight and presented it as a fait accompli, and he stood very still and said, "The proportions are correct," which Dottie told me was the most romantic thing she'd heard all year. The noodle aisle is still in aisle 6. The 3-packet policy has been quietly retired. I discovered this when I brought 5 to the counter in October, and he simply scanned them, but we have never officially discussed this. It exists as an unspoken peace treaty, the terms of which include him hiding my preferred flavor under the counter, and me not arriving before 7:30 a.m., except on the mornings I bring him coffee, which somehow doesn't count. Marcus Webb came back in November. He came not as an envoy but as a visitor, stayed 2 nights at the inn, ate Dottie's pastries until she put a polite limit on it, and walked around Millhaven with the expression of a man trying to understand what someone found here. On the second day I saw him sitting on the bench outside the store, talking to Julian like an actual human being rather than a shareholder. And when I came out with 2 mugs of tea, he accepted one and said, "He's different here." Not as a criticism, more like a discovery. "I know," I said. Julian reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear with the matter-of-fact tenderness of a man who has been doing this for years rather than months. And Marcus looked at us with the expression of someone completing a complicated equation. He left the next morning and sent a very professional email saying Holt Industries was doing fine, actually, and he hoped we were well. The store is doing fine too. Better than fine. Julian introduced a local supplier program, stocks Dottie's jams alongside a shelf of my illustrated card prints, and has organized a community bulletin board that people actually use. Millhaven, generally, has adopted him in the way small towns do, with total unsolicited involvement in his personal life and a fierce protectiveness if anyone outside says anything unkind. Last Tuesday, Mrs. Hooper from the end of the lane told Julian he was the best thing to happen to this town since the library got new beanbag chairs. Julian said thank you, and then told me about it later with the slightly disoriented expression of someone still learning that being loved by a small community is a different thing entirely from being admired by a large one. I kissed him in the middle of aisle 6. He said the shrimp flavor noodles were not properly centered. He was repositioning them with one arm while keeping the other around me when the doorbell rang and Dottie walked in and said, "Oh, pumpkin," at a volume intended for the whole street, and I decided that nothing ever changes in Millhaven, and I meant it entirely as a compliment. Thanks for spending time with Flustered novel. If this story made you laugh, blush, or scream at the characters, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and come back for more chaotic romance stories. See you in the next novel.